Hi, and welcome to episode 4 of my Samantha Smith series. This is going to be titled The CIA Did It, a guide to navigate through the disinformation and misinformation minefield of information in order to find the truth. This will be part 1. It's probably going to be 3 parts. Part 1 here, I'll talk about how to go about researching. And if you have a thesis, what to do and what not to do if you want to sway people and convince people of what you're trying to research. I titled it The CIA Did It, and that's a great example of making an accusation and then trying to get people to get behind what you're saying, but without anything of substance behind it. You see that a lot with a lot of things that happen. You just say the CIA did it, or whatever. And most people are like, yeah, right, right. They're a fitting example of what not to say when questioning an event and looking for truths within the questions and accusations being presented. I mean, the last thing any investigator wants to do is shout out baseless and specific accusations without anything to back it up. Even if they may have the possibility of being true, if there's nothing of substance backing up the accusations, and it's just a one-dimensional statement, then you make yourself look and sound less credible, and in turn you make it much easier for someone to write you off as a tinfoil hat loon, which a lot of people like to say. If someone or some entity or organization is trying to cover something up from being investigated, the best thing that can happen for them is for random people to make unproven accusations, blaming someone specific, like the government, the CIA, Ronald Reagan, without a shred of evidence. If someone does that, it's far too easy to just write them off as crazy. The proverbial conspiracy theorist, not that there's anything technically wrong with being a conspiracy theorist at all, but the overwhelming sentiment from the general public is largely negative with that. One thing that's infuriating, and I know a lot of people see stuff like this, if you're on Facebook or any of the social media things, when someone shares a meme on social media claiming something, and then with a simple 2-minute search on Google, you can refute the entire meme, pretty easily. It's really infuriating, when someone shares a meme that has something that's critical and true in it, but it's mixed in with a bunch of other statements that are completely false or absurd. That's one of the worst things that can happen, because then that piece of information that is true or critical can easily be written off because it's been mixed in with all of the other nonsense. While the people who are sharing these memes usually, are sharing them innocently enough, it is kind of a tactic of those wanting to cover up things to sprinkle truth in with something called disinformation. And then, use the unknowing person that's sharing it to disseminate the strategically placed disinformation and discredit something of value. You see that happen a lot on social media. That's something that's always there. And one thing to know, I am a history major. I have a degree in history. So, this is something that I was trained to do for 4 years. I really, so going into looking into something like this, I already know off the bat, you don't want to just make an accusation and not have anything to back it up. When I was going through my 4 years, I even took a history course called historiography, which is basically the history of history. And you go through and you see how things have been written down and remembered through time, and how they go through different phases and periods of different agendas and different ways of looking at things. And so history can change, from generation to generation, depending on what's being, pushed as the main avenue of how they want to perceive the history. An example back when I was taking my history classes. It was the mid '90s ish in that vicinity, and I remember going to my professor. He was his name was Sungbak Kim, and I had gone in and I was really interested in researching Nathaniel Green, who I brought up before on a previous video, and I had been really researching towards the end of his life and the kind of suspicious way that he had died. I don't want to go into it right now, but anyway, I had brought this up to Professor Kim, and he kind of looked at me and thought I was crazy when I brought that up. And I remember thinking, it was kind of discouraging at the time. And what he pushed me towards and talking about, this historiography type, was that he thought that I should go into researching women's history. And he said that that's going to be the next thing that everybody's going to be pushing towards, researching women and that sort of thing. So it's just an example of how they push different agendas towards history, and you look at now, there is a lot of push towards that and different racial issues and things like that. And it's kind of interesting because here I am researching Samantha, which is basically along the same lines, although I'm not so sure he would be on board with what I'm trying to say here, given how he reacted about Nathaniel Green. But anyway, getting back to my point about being a history major. So I already know different strategies to use when looking into something, and just making an accusation without anything to back it up is not the best way to go about it. The best way to research is by getting as close to the primary source as possible. It seems pretty logical to say that, but it is true. Start with going directly towards the people who were involved. Try to find specific things that were said and quoted, that kind of thing. With Samantha's case here, there really isn't anybody. There wasn't anybody that survived the plane crash. So, as far as that goes, with the plane crash, that's a pretty difficult thing to do. But the people who were involved around it and before and all that, the best thing to do is, try to get as close to the primary source as possible. Doing a direct interview, that's one of the best places to start if there's people that are still alive and are willing to give interviews. After that, you can look for interviews in newspapers, magazines, documents, things like that. Newspapers and magazines, books are a good place to look. Books that may have already been written about the subject, I always provide a good place to get different viewpoints. Also, they usually have other sources that are documented that you can go and then check those sources out as well. And that's always a great place to start as well. And using as many various sources that you can about the subject, from as many different viewpoints as possible. And then you can tie the pieces together as you see fit with that. Opinion pieces, hearsay, things of that nature are obviously not as dependable, but they still do serve a purpose and are useful. But that's really, the last place you want to go. That's really starting out with the primary source and then going, into looking at, newspapers, books, things like that. That's usually, the best way to go about it when you're starting out. So that brings me back, to the point about having a preconceived idea and conclusion before ever even looking into the subject matter. You don't really want to do that. There's definitely a more constructive way to effectively take on the subject that's surrounded with questions and suspicions. Instead of only focusing on the specific names, organizations thrown around randomly, trying to prove those, which can lead, it leads to a type of like a tunnel vision, and can certainly, lead to overlooking certain facts that otherwise could be crucial towards the investigation. It's best to just go in with a clean slate and start from square one, and not try to prove one accusation or another over the other. You can just ask yourself the basic questions. Decide whether the event itself seems worthy of enough of investigation, and then let the information come to you, and it'll eventually, reveal the truth, lead you towards the truth. By taking the time to do this, if what you're suspecting has validity, even if it's circumstantial, you'll have gathered enough information to plead your case and back up any accusations that you've made. And who knows? Just by taking the time to do this, you may find that all of the accusations are valid. Who knows? Many times, just looking at the facts, can also sometimes reveal certain connections and patterns that were otherwise unnoticed, and patterns can then lead towards other truths that start making certain accusations seem even more credible. You never know. The point I'm making is researching without any preconceived biases is definitely the best way to approach, finding the underlying cause of any mystery. That's, going with a clean slate and go where the information leads you, basically. And so that's how I decided to take on investigating the crash, of Bar Harbor Flight 1808. I didn't look at someone or something specifically causing the intentional crash of an airplane, which is what I'm saying is what happened. But I simply asked myself, is it possible that the flight was not an accident? I mean, that's basically where I started. And then I figured I would let the information guide me. As I mentioned before, the initial accusations emanating from the Soviet Union and the United States revolved around, as we said, this guy, Ronald Reagan. I saw a lot of that when I first started researching. I guess, it's possible. It's very hard to prove an accusation like that, as is the perennial CIA that everybody likes to use as well. But there was also the cast of Lime Street, like I mentioned before. This is a picture of John Standing and Robert Wagner, which that's a shocking one. But there actually were accusations. Harry Thomason, one of the producers of Lime Street, actually reaffirmed that in an interview. But then there's stuff that I brought up in my last video about Greta, was the United Nations, and that's something that I hadn't seen anywhere. But going in and researching, information leads you towards different things, and United Nations was one with the Lucis Trust. I spoke about that briefly in episode 3, and Peace Child. They came up a lot as well. So you can lump them in with all of the other accusations. And I didn't go into detail on these things, but that's kind of the point, with talking about researching and starting from square one and where is it going to lead you. As we go on, we'll see just where this stuff all plays into it. But it really is a mystery. I mean, that really is the bottom line. You go into something like this, and first, you want to know, was it suspicious? Were all of these accusations valid? Where were they coming from exactly? And that's kind of where I started. That was my starting point with all of this. So the first questions that came to my mind, for consideration, were whether the plane crash was extraordinary. And by extraordinary, I mean, did it seem, not like a normal crash? Were there any extraordinary circumstances towards it? That kind of thing. And also, a question you always ask with plane crashes: were there passengers on the plane that would warrant someone desiring to bring the plane down on purpose? Were there important people on the plane? So if these two questions came back with an affirmative yes, indicating some validity to the accusations, then it would be worthy of exploring further. And in my mind, both questions come back with a resounding yes. The plane crash was, by most accounts, it was pretty devastating, beyond anything that you would think a small prop plane would be capable of. A lot of the descriptions of it were that it went up like napalm. There were multiple explosions heard. The plane was well off course and erratic from the start. So all of that, is there. So that one's a definite yes. And second, obviously on board was Samantha and her father, Arthur. So right there, you've got someone who was in the mainstream limelight, was involved with political agendas. Very important person. And to be honest, as I researched even more, I found that it wasn't only Samantha and Arthur who had some importance that were on that plane. There was at least one other passenger who had some important things that they were working on at the time when the plane crashed. I'll go into that down the road. I won't go into it right now, but just the point being that both of those questions, the plane crash was definitely extraordinary, and there were important people on that plane. Two things right there that I would say would warrant looking at it further and deeper. So you have a political figure and a devastating plane crash combined. Two things that would lend some credence towards possible foul play. And given this, I mean, we go back and we can look at Ronald Reagan, CIA, Lime Street, which was what Samantha was working on when the plane crashed, and as I brought up before, the United Nations and that stuff, all could very well be possible. Given who was on the plane and the devastation that the plane crash caused, certainly this stuff is possible. But you still don't know at this point. But there could have been some motive within those lists of accusations. Absolutely. So establishing this, I figured the next logical step would be to look at the plane crash itself, digging into newspapers, newspaper clippings, television news reports, the actual investigation of the NTSB itself. But before even doing that, I wanted to dig first into the allegations of foul play, and start to understand those, determine as accurately as I could how many existed, what they were, and when they all occurred, and who was saying them, and by doing that, I hoped that I'd get a clearer understanding, of how deep the rabbit hole actually goes with this. That's something that I want traveling down that, and building some solid foundation was basically my idea of what I wanted to do with that. I wanted to, just kind of corral all of that, organize it, see where it was coming from, who was saying it, when, all of that stuff. So I initially focused on, I was going to focus on the period from immediately after the plane crash, August 25th, 1985, and just go until the allegations would disappear for the most part. I assume there'd be articles that would span the entire period up until, present day. But what I found out was that actually was not the case. I actually stumbled onto, what appeared to be an interesting pattern that seemed to develop regarding Samantha and the rumored accusations of foul play. These accusations, they appeared to be bundled into what seemed to be a coordinated disinformation campaign that was targeting the Soviet Union, coming from the Soviet Union. Most of the talk would eventually die down, and then it would be brought up again at various moments. There was like an ebb and flow to it, and it seemed to go right up until the time the Reagan administration was on the verge of ending, and right around the Moscow summit in 1988. It was after that it really all just disappeared. All of these accusations of foul play, there would be little moments here and there, but scattered throughout the years. But there, it wasn't as condensed as it was in this 3-year period. So that was one of the first things that I seemed to come across, was this pattern. And uncovering all this, it really did give me the sense that it seemed like something's up here. That with the pattern that was forming with it. And on top of that, it seemed like there was a concerted effort between the U.S. intelligence and connected journalists in various newspapers to promote the Soviet rumors as disinformation and misinformation, these kinds of things. It seemed like the rumors would be collected by intelligence and documented and then pushed, by Washington, D.C. correspondents and other high-up journalists in respective newspapers. And they'd eventually be picked up by the smaller newspaper outlets and then disseminated for mass consumption. And one thing, like sprinkled in with more serious and well-known conspiracies of the time, this is one thing that I found, would be Samantha's crash. And I'll go into the other more serious conspiracy type disinformation things that the U.S. was concerned with coming out of Russia. They're definitely far more political and more important than you would think than Samantha's plane crash, but yet she was mixed in with all of this stuff. It seemed like it was an effective approach, since it's how most people would gather their news and opinions at that time. It was from the local newspapers, TV stations, and things like that. So if you put Samantha's crash in with these other more serious allegations, and really you're thinking they were trying to make it seem like this is all conspiracy theory nonsense, all of it. And so basically Samantha's plane crash was being included and would get thrown out with the trash. That's kind of the vibe that I was getting from seeing this. The theories, they were more prevalent, more outrageous, belonged in what would be considered the fringe category of the time. And, as Samantha's plane crash was just a simple plane crash, you would think it wouldn't be attached to that. So while they're discussing some outlandish conspiracies, Samantha's plane crash would get attached and then be given the stigma that it too must be as outlandish and not true. The campaign seemed to be coordinated and with a specific end target in mind, which was the Moscow summit, because then after that occurred, there was nothing. I really could not find anything in the media regarding Samantha's plane crash. The disinformation campaign stopped immediately. I'll go into that's kind of what this series, these 3 parts will be about, is me going through these and I'll show how they sprouted up and the ebb and flow between being centered around the different summits. There was let's see if we can go to there were here in that time period, there were 4 summits. Obviously, the first one was the Geneva summit, and that one happened right after Samantha died. And the timing on that is pretty odd. But they never even mentioned Samantha at that summit. But that was an important summit. It was in November of '85, right after Lime Street finally aired, and that summit actually was the first time that you would see Ronald Reagan actually talking about these exchanges of students and people between the two countries, which is basically what Samantha stood for. But then you had the Reykjavik, Iceland summit, the Washington, D.C. summit, and then the Moscow one, which was May 29th to June 1st in 1988. And all of this stuff was sprinkled in between these four summits. But it wasn't only the summits. There were other events. Like I have here. Let me go to it here. That's not it. But anyway, you can see here. There, I have the crash, and then there's the Geneva summit. But then also centered around here with all of the accusations and things was the NTSB hearings that happened in Portland in January. As you can see, there's some things after that happened, and I'll go into detail on all of that stuff in the next episodes. But there was the NTSB final report that came out in September of '86. There was Jane's lawsuit that actually happened as well, sometime in the late '86 into 1987 time frame. There were other things that actually that were involved with this pattern that was developing between the disinformation and the accusations and all of that stuff. And I'm gonna talk about that in the next episodes. But something that I wanted to bring up before I end this episode was that if you talk to a lot of people about Samantha Smith, they do think, why would they want to kill a child? And it's a good question. It's a legitimate question. But they always say that, I mean, she was really just a girl that went to the Soviet Union, was televised, that kind of thing. And she really wasn't as important as you would think somebody, if they were going to be a target of an assassination, that they would be. But going through all of this in just this one section, I did learn how important she really was. The U.S. government and the media kind of downplayed all of that about Samantha. But to bring her up in disinformation campaigns, and there actually was, the FBI did have a file on Samantha. They claimed that it wasn't directly about Samantha. It was just people who were involved with Samantha, but they still did. And they even said that she served her country well. The FBI said this. She was way more important than they'll let you believe. So that's an important point that I wanted to make before I end this, was that Samantha was very, very highly regarded and involved in political agendas, and it was definitely more important than a lot of people realize. And the charisma and spell that she held over the Soviet Union, they downplay that as well. But I know there are a lot of people who were young in the Soviet Union at that time who loved Samantha, and they still love Samantha to this day. Were affected by all of this, and that's another important piece in all of this. But Samantha was very important. We'll end it with that. But anyway, yeah. So the next episode, I'll actually start going through and detailing all of the exact accusations that I found, and we'll take a look at all of it and where it came from and the patterns that developed, and even with the accusations of foul play and things like that ended after the summit in Moscow in 1988. There was actually a Samantha Smith television movie throughout all of this as well that was going to be produced by Robert Wagner that followed the same pattern. It came up, and it was huge, and they had the project going, and then all of a sudden, I mean, like that, like in an instant, it was gone, and there was nothing about it after that Moscow summit. Same deal. But I'll go into this in detail in the next video. Hopefully you like this one, and I'll see you in the next one. All right. Thanks for listening.